all of you to this special one-day conference on the South China Sea. It's my pleasure to introduce Bill Hayton. As you know, he's an associate a fellow with the Asia Pacific program at Chatham House. He's also a journalist with BBC News and has been since 1998, which means you're coming up for your Silver Jubilee fairly shortly. He was the BBC's reporter in Vietnam in 2006-07 and also spent a year with the state broadcaster in Myanmar in 2013-2014, both very fascinating experiences. Bill's work has for a long time involved engagement with the South China Sea disputes, as well as the sort of the broader region. He's the author of a number of impressive books, including Vietnam, Rising Dragon, that came out in 2010, the South China Sea, The Struggle for Power in Asia, that I think was 2014, The Invention of China, Yale University Press in 2020, and I saw on the website a new one this year, A Brief History of Vietnam, Colonialism, War and Renewal. It looks really interesting. I look forward to hearing more about it. So without further ado, I'll turn to Bill and look forward to hearing you speak.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. That's great. It's very nice to be here. Thanks to Faisal for the introduction, to Todd and of course Dr. Ravi for all the organisation and for St. Anthony's and the China Centre for hosting. I was involved in Dr. Ravi's last South China Sea workshop, which was here in Oxford 5 years ago. And my presentation back then was entitled, "What's Wrong with the Status Quo?" And I was arguing that the best outcome that we could expect in the South China Sea would be some kind of informal arrangement in which all the different claimants to the various rocks and reefs would hold on to those things that they already possess and then agree among themselves not to try to push any of the other claimants off the ones that they hold. And I still think that's the best way to try to manage the disputes. It's just a sad fact that it's not an outcome that any state is willing to publicly support at the moment. But I also talked about some developments that pointed towards a more conflictual future, one in which disputes over maritime resources worsened the relations between the claimants. And back in 2017, China had just successfully blocked a gas development off Vietnam by sending the vice chair of the Central Military Commission to Hanoi. And it wasn't just Vietnam, all the other Southeast Asian claimants were having trouble with China off their coasts. So where are we now, 5 years later? Well, the good news is there hasn't been a war and the status quo has held, at least in terms of which countries occupy which features. The bad news is, firstly, that there are no moves towards a resolution of the underlying territorial disputes. And secondly, that the status quo has very much not held when it comes to maritime resources. The Southeast Asian states are losing control of the fish and the oil and the gas fields off their coasts, and that's affecting their domestic economies, as well as undermining the status of UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, as a foundation of international law. China has been able to impose its understanding of the rules in defiance of other people's versions. Right. So China's version of the rules is that the famous U-shaped 9-dash line, versions of which have appeared on Chinese maps since 1948, is some kind of maritime boundary. And as I'll try to show, one of the major changes over the past 5 years has been China's increased ability to determine what happens within this line. China's been able to do this by being able to deploy sufficient force to deter its rivals. And a key factor in this has been the development of 7 artificial islands in the Spratlys, known in Chinese as the Nansha, in the southern part of the sea. Now, we're fortunate to be able to see some of these bases in unprecedented clarity because of the release last month of a set of new images taken by Philippine photographer Ezra Akayan. I've selected just a few, there are many more online, and these are of the 3 largest bases, the ones with the 3,000-meter long runways. This is the runway at Subi Reef, the northernmost feature occupied by China in the Spratlys, eerily empty of people and life, yet at the same time we can see they appear to be well maintained. This one is Fiery Cross Reef, the furthest to the west of the Chinese bases in the Spratlys, and you can clearly see an airborne early warning plane landing on the runway. Possibly in the front, some buildings have been damaged by typhoons. The bases were fantastically expensive to build. One Chinese report from 2015 put the cost of this base alone at $11 billion or so. And there are 2 others this size, plus another 4 smaller ones. There's a lot of talk about how maintaining these bases will be a drain on the Chinese state budget for many years to come. But at the moment, that seems to be a drain that the Chinese state seems willing to absorb. This is Mischief Reef, the most southeasterly of China's holdings in the Spratlys, and the one nearest the main islands of the Philippines. And the notable features here, and there are similar buildings on the other larger bases, are hangars for what appear to be surface-to-air missiles on the left. They have retractable roofs so that the missiles can fire out. And on the right, sea-facing hangars for anti-ship cruise missiles that have big doors at the front and smaller doors at the back for the blast to go out. We don't know whether the missiles are actually in the buildings, but they're clearly there and ready to be used should some kind of crisis emerge. And another close-up picture from Mischief Reef shows a surveillance plane, a transport plane, at least semi-permanently stationed on Mischief Reef, providing a persistent capability to monitor developments across the whole region. Now, all of these photos are similarly kind of empty of human beings, and things are pretty quiet in general across the South China Sea. In fact, these pictures are almost like a sort of metaphor for the overall situation in the South China Sea. China is in a pretty dominant position, or at least that's the impression that China wants to give to other parties. It may well be that there are problems on the islands that we can't see. We know that salt water does bad things to people and to sophisticated electronics. And it might explain why we see such little activity, because actually it's such an unpleasant place to be that China doesn't put too many people there. But it's clear that the patrol aircraft, the radar, and the other sensor systems give China the capacity to know what's going on and to direct Navy, Coast Guard, and maritime militia to block the activities of other claimants. And all that's enabling China to impose greater and greater control. So how do we explain the current quietness in the South China Sea? I think there are 3 main factors. One, I think, is that China is feeling confident. Its leadership thinks that time and economic power are on its side. Chinese officials generally use 2 terms to describe their country's agenda in the South China Sea: rights protection and stability management. Rights protection is when Chinese forces do something to push back against the other claimants, thereby protecting China's rights to territory as it sees it. Stability management is the other half, which is about keeping everything quiet and trying to improve relations with the other claimants. And it's like a ratchet, tightening things up periodically and then still, but like a ratchet, it only ever goes one way. I would suggest the second major factor behind the current quiet has been the Communist Party Congress in China this year. The party leadership didn't want anything to upset the preparations or undermine its assertions of stability. Internally, China had enough going on with COVID, with problems in the property market and ballooning local government debt, to want to keep the external environment quiet. And I think the other factor, the third, is the political situation in the other main claimant countries in Southeast Asia. And I think we'll hear more about that from other presenters later today, but I'll just sketch out some impressions. Starting with Vietnam. Excuse me. So the leader of the Vietnamese Communist Party, Nguyen Phu Trong, visited Beijing. He was the first foreign leader to visit after the Chinese Party Congress. And in their joint statement, amid all the usual boilerplate language, they included a new section on the shared global outlook of communist-ruled states. It included a line pledging the 2 countries to work together in the fight against terrorism, peaceful evolution, color revolution, and the politicization of human rights issues. For those who don't know, color revolution is the term that the Chinese and Vietnamese Communist parties use to describe political pluralism and the possibility of a peaceful transfer of power away from communism. So the two countries have or the two communist parties have pledged to do their bit to stand firm against that. And we have to remember that Chom himself, like Xi, is a Leninist first and foremost. And what matters most to him is the Communist Party of Vietnam's leading position in Vietnam. And in this view, that means keeping close to China and resisting efforts to bring pluralism. And Mr. Chom and the Vietnamese Politburo are prepared to incur major costs in order to maintain tight relations with China. They've been willing to, for example, pay over $1 billion in compensation to oil and gas companies for having cancelled energy exploration. So this is a map of the area off the southeastern coast of Vietnam. And I've sort of sketched in the U-shaped line in white here. But what's happened since 2017, since our last gathering here, was a series of Vietnam's energy exploration efforts have been cancelled, all of which were just on the wrong side, i.e. the Chinese side, if you like, of the U-shaped line. But activity here has been able to continue, and so China, in effect, has prevented Vietnam from developing oil and gas reserves on the other side of the U-shaped line. And the consequences of this are far-reaching. Apart from just paying the $1 billion in compensation, the state budget is losing revenue. So according to the IMF's most recent country report, the Vietnamese government's revenue from oil and gas was just 0.5% of GDP last year. That's down from 3.5% less than 10 years ago, and down from 1% 4 years ago. So it's a significant drop. It hasn't caused a crisis for the Vietnamese economy because other sectors continue to boom. However, those sectors don't deliver the same amounts of revenue to the central state budget as a state-owned hydrocarbon industry. So the real amounts available for discretionary state spending have dropped, squeezing the government's ability to fund budgetary commitments. And that's obliged the Vietnamese government to raise more income from taxation and to borrow more heavily to fund infrastructure and other things. And there are other effects too. Vietnam has moved from being a net energy exporter to a net importer. The country's Institute of Energy calculates the country's demand for electricity is going to grow at around 8% for the next 20 years. And that demand is supposed to be met by gas from the South China Sea feeding onshore power stations. And that now seems unlikely. There are going to be electricity bottlenecks as the country fails to keep up with the pace of growth. Vietnam's other response has been to embark on a big gas import program, and I'll talk about that a bit more later. In the also to build a coal-fired power station. So here's one that's just been recently finished, and so in effect, a lot of these are being built by Chinese contractors. So China is stopping Vietnam from developing gas. And its contractors are picking up the business of building coal-fired power stations in Vietnam. And as you may know, coal is twice as dirty as gas per unit of energy generated. On the other side of the South China Sea, in the Philippines, the new president, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., Bongbong, who once attended Oxford, I think graduated is a bit too strong, but he was here. He was, after his inauguration at the end of June, he was quickly visited by the Chinese Foreign Minister, Wang Yi. And in the resulting statements, they said, the South China Sea's issue is not the mainstream of the Philippines-China relationship and shouldn't hinder or restrict bilateral cooperation. The Philippine side is willing to carry out candid communication with the Chinese side to find a friendly solution to the issue, which is the right way for the two countries to get along. So there's a recognition there are some big disputes between the two sides. Marcos took power after 6 years of President Duterte, who came into office himself seeking to build better relations with China, mainly as an alternative to dependency on the US. Just before Duterte's inauguration in 2016, he was gifted a massive win on the South China Sea issue with a comprehensive victory at an international arbitral tribunal in a case about which country had the rights to the resources off the Philippines coast. But Duterte did nothing with that victory, trading the opportunity to press for gas development in exchange for greater Chinese investment in his domestic economy and a quiet political life. In May 2017, Duterte told journalists that his Chinese counterpart, Xi Jinping, had warned him that if the Philippines tried to develop the gas fields out in the South China Sea, there would, in his words, be war. Nevertheless, Duterte did make some moves that China didn't like, particularly rebuilding a runway on the main island that the Philippines holds, Titu or Pagasa. And he refused to back down on the principles of UNCLOS, the law of the sea, and didn't give way on China's demands for joint development. When China talks about joint development, what it's really talking about is some form of joint sovereignty, whereby the other states recognize that China has actual legal rights within the 9- or the U-shaped line. And that's always been a position which the Southeast Asian states collectively have refused to back down on. But he did repair this runway here on Pagasa. Unfortunately, shortly after they did that, a massive typhoon came through and destroyed a lot of the structures on the island. You can see the damage in this satellite photograph here. The Marcos administration is now trying to work out what it's going to do on the South China Sea issue. While it is licensing some energy companies to develop in the South China Sea, it's keeping them out of areas within the U-shaped line, within the Chinese claim, if you like. There's going to be another meeting in about 10 days' time where they plan their way forward, and maybe we're hearing from Justice Carpio a bit later on in the event, so maybe he'll be able to tell us a bit more about that. In the meantime, it's in Indonesia and Malaysia who are the ones who are really pushing ahead with energy development in the South China Sea, which is unusual because they historically are the ones that have been the least vocal when it comes to the political side of it, but they have been more assertive in defending their claims, more assertive than the Vietnamese and the Philippines governments, for example. In the past year or so, in 2021, a British company called Harbour Energy is developing a drill site and has been harassed by the Chinese Coast Guard, doing in areas within the U-shaped line, which are part of Indonesia's exclusive economic zone. And Malaysia has also come under some pressure. So what we're ending up with is a picture of activity in the South China Sea, where it really does seem that China is using the 9- line, the U-shaped line, as some kind of boundary. And we can see this in the way that China has responded to some of these activities by the other countries. It has deliberately sent seismic oil and gas exploration vessels into the other countries' exclusive economic zones. And you can see from the tracks that are traced by these vessels how China has been using the 9- line as a boundary. And I'll try to explain. So after Vietnam did some exploratory drills, there were drills off the Vietnamese coast, and then down here in the Indonesian plain. So this is Indonesia, this is the plain from there. These are the Chinese surveys here. Here's a bit of Malaysia, these are the Chinese surveys here, and obviously these are the Vietnamese ones up here. And these are clearly deliberately targeted to show to the other claimants that China has the capacity to close the sea in these areas, to keep other claimants out, and theoretically in the future, maybe even to drill for oil and gas itself in parts of the sea, which under normal interpretations of the sea would belong to the coastal states, the Southeast Asian states. And you can see how the curve of the line here is matched by the way these survey tracks have been used. So it's clear, this seems to be the agenda, is that, without really any sort of formal legal basis, China is operating on the assumption that this line actually means something and has some legal force. Now, I realize it's a bit strange to be here talking about the rights of countries to develop oil and gas when in Egypt right now, all the countries of the world are gathering to talk about how to reduce their carbon emissions and move away from oil and gas. Perhaps China is doing the world a favor by blocking Southeast Asian countries from energy development in parts of the South China Sea. But this isn't really the complete picture, of course. For one thing, China is not ceasing its own offshore developments in northern parts of the South China Sea. And blocking Vietnam and the Philippines from development of their own resources is not going to cause them to reduce the carbon intensity of their own economies. If anything, it's going to do the opposite. So we're seeing, I mean, Vietnam and the Philippines are two of the countries that are likely to be worst affected by climate change, increased intensity of typhoons, flooding, and all the rest of it. But what they're doing is replacing their energy from the South China Sea with imported energy. So Vietnam is pursuing two tactics, returning to coal, but also seeking to import gas from abroad. At the moment, Vietnam has plans for 6 LNG import terminals in Vietnam, which is a huge number when you think that Britain makes do with 3. And it's a similar situation in the Philippines. The Malampaya gas field, which supplies 20% of the country's electricity, is running out. But instead of developing other gas reserves under the Reed Bank, which is slightly further out into the South China Sea, the Philippines is choosing to import gas from abroad. This is a new gas import terminal being constructed in a place called Batangas in the Philippines. 3 of these will come on stream early next year, and 3 more within a further 3 years. And this gas will be coming not from the South China Sea, but from the Middle East and from Australia, where it's going to connect with the existing gas to power system that previously took gas from the Malampaya field. And this is going to completely change the economics of energy in Southeast Asia. Once import terminals like this are in place, together with long-term contracts to import gas for electricity generation, the case for developing Southeast Asia's own reserves becomes far less commercially viable. So rather than being in charge of their own energy, Vietnam and the Philippines, and potentially other countries, will become much more vulnerable to external price movements, and they will be much less able to generate income from their own hydrocarbon reserves, with implications for their state budget and all the rest. So energy economics, domestic budgets, and of course fisheries are all suffering from from China's behavior towards the Southeast Asian claimants. Now, a lot of people have talked about the possibility of a code of conduct to sort out the ongoing disputes between the Southeast Asian countries and China in the South China Sea. It's worth, now ASEAN will be meeting, it's having its summit this weekend, and associated with that will be the ASEAN Plus events, including the ASEAN Plus China meeting. And that meeting will mark the 20th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea in 2002, a document that was intended to pave the way for a full code of conduct that would regulate the disputes and hopefully eliminate them. But 20 years later, despite the DOC and the subsequent guidelines on a COC, which were approved in 2011, a framework for a COC approved in 2017, a single draft negotiating text agreed in 2018, a first reading of that text in 2019, the region is still no nearer an actual code of conduct. Talks on a second reading are expected to be agreed. We may see soon, we may see some progress at the summit, but the same issues are blocking progress on the code of conduct, just as they have done ever since the beginning. The question of where it should apply to, should it just be the Spratly Islands? Should it include the Paracel Islands, which Vietnam cares about? Should it include Scarborough Shoal, which the Philippines cares about? The same issues come back and go round and round. Another question is whether it should be legally binding. Some of the smaller countries want the state to have some kind of legal force. China doesn't want it to have any kind of legal force at all. And the same issues just come round and round and round. From the Chinese side, they're pushing for language which would prevent a role for external energy companies in any areas of maritime economic cooperation, i.e. oil and gas development, nor should there be any joint military exercises with countries from outside the region, say, Japan, the US, Australia, the UK, or other European powers. So ultimately, really, the Southeast Asian countries want a code of conduct because they believe it will constrain China's behavior. But China, on the other hand, sees no reason to agree to allow its behavior to be constrained. Instead, it wants a code of conduct to constrain the United States by giving China a veto over the activities of American military forces and American energy companies in the region. So I think it's fair to say that the prospects for a code of conduct now are just as dim as they were when the idea first emerged out of an ASEAN foreign ministers meeting about 26 years ago. Other countries have been taking more of an interest in the South China Sea, including the British Carrier Strike Group that went through the region last year. But all of the G7 countries, with the exception of Italy, have made some kind of gesture, some kind of voyage through the South China Sea. Britain and France are the European powers that have had the most enduring presence, but even Germany finally showed up last year. The Five Eyes countries, the UK, US, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, have been maintaining a regular presence, including transits of the Taiwan Strait as well. So there was definitely an increase, I think, in outside attention, but the question really is whether the agendas of the outside powers match the agendas of the claimant states. My feeling is, for example, from the Vietnamese perspective, is that what the Vietnamese are engaging with the United States about is really a means of trying to keep the US engaged in the region as a diplomatic tool, but never giving them enough influence to actually change the outcomes internally in Vietnam. And so it's a way of the Communist Party sort of somehow giving the US an anchor in its own survival, while also keeping them at arm's length. And so the other countries themselves have their own different agendas when it comes to how they're playing the outside powers. I thought, just since Taiwan was quite a big issue kind of earlier in the year, just think about how the South China Sea situation is playing into Taiwan contingencies. Taiwan, apart from the main island itself, controls two features in the South China Sea: Pratas in Chinese Dongsha, sort of between Hong Kong and Luzon up there, and Ituaba, the largest island known in Chinese as Taiping Dao, down in the Spratlys here, both of which are extremely isolated and vulnerable to blockades and pressure, and could be, a lever that China might use against Taiwan in some future kind of conflict here. But I think the other thing is, strategically, you can see, why controlling the Spratlys and the power cells up there would be useful in any kind of Taiwan contingency. The bases, the missiles, the radar systems and things that China have installed here would be very useful and capable in preventing US forces moving through this part of the sea, or even through the Philippines in a time of conflict. And also, we've seen China developing the capacity to hide its ballistic and other missile submarines in the deep waters of the South China Sea here, and that's also clearly part of a deterrent angle when it comes to any future conflict with the US. So these bases perform many functions, partly to do with resources and keeping the Southeast Asian countries out, but also in the bigger strategic picture, keeping the Americans out in some kind of future warlike contingency. Are there any grounds for optimism? Well, one is that from the Southeast Asian perspective, they are still clinging to their belief in UNCLOS and their rights under international law. Another element is that we haven't seen China tear up the language of international law and UNCLOS. We've seen it try and stretch it, reinterpret it, offer new legal justifications, but still to talk and work within the parameters of international law, and that more states are taking an interest from the European side, from other Asian powers too. And there's clearly a willingness to work together to try and defend these frameworks, which have held together since UNCLOS was approved 40 years ago next month. So I think, where do we stand now? We have I think a situation where China, I think, feels very confident that it's in control. I think the logic of China's behavior ultimately is that it has a territorial imperative, that China sees Taiwan, the South China Sea, some of the islands in the East China Sea, add in maybe even the Himalayan situation as well, as a sort of as part of its attempts to, well, it's China dream. The great rejuvenation of the Chinese people will only be fully realized once all of these bits of land, whether they're big or small, whether they're useful or not, are incorporated and under the control of the People's Republic of China. So I think that's the logic of where we're going. But I think it feels at the moment, when it comes to the South China Sea, it can bide its time, safe in a feeling that the change is inevitable, and that its growing economic and military power compared to the US's relative decline will facilitate this at some point. And squeezed in the middle are the Southeast Asian countries who are more worried about sort of day-to-day questions, the survival of fishing communities, the budgets of development banks and that kind of thing. So it's a quiet at the moment, but I think it's an uneasy quiet, and one which is quite stifling rather than one that I think is a positive for the region. Okay.